There are people who walk into a crowded room and feel their heart expand. They feed on the noise, the laughter, the constant exchange of words and presence. And then there are those who walk into that same room and feel something inside them slowly dim. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from a quiet, persistent exhaustion that no one else seems to understand. If you've ever left a party feeling emptier than when you arrived, if you've ever smiled through conversations while counting the minutes until you could leave, if you've ever wondered why something that energizes others drains you completely, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not broken. This isn't about shyness. It's not about being unfriendly or antisocial. It's about the fundamental way your inner world processes the outer one. It's about energy, presence, and the cost of being surrounded by people when your soul requires silence to breathe. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who spent years in contemplative solitude, once wrote about the paradox of human connection. He understood that some people are built to find God themselves, and truth not in the crowd but in the quiet. Not because they reject others, but because their depth requires space. He knew that for some, solitude isn't loneliness. It's oxygen. And here lies the great paradox. In a world that celebrates extroversion, that equates social energy with health and happiness, those who need silence are often made to feel as though something is wrong with them. They're told they need to be more outgoing, more present, more engaged. They're asked why they're so quiet, as if silence were a problem to be solved. They're encouraged to push past their discomfort, to force themselves into spaces that feel unnatural, exhausting and strangely hollow. But what if the exhaustion you feel isn't a flaw? What if it's actually a sign of something deeper, a different way of experiencing the world, one that the modern age has forgotten how to honor? Let's begin where it always begins. With that moment when you realize you're different. You're at a gathering, a birthday, a wedding, a casual get-together. Everyone around you seems alive in a way you can't quite access. They move from person to person with ease. They laugh loudly. They speak without hesitation. They seem to gain something from every interaction, as if each conversation adds a spark to their inner fire. And you? You feel yourself fading, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally, slowly, like a candle burning in a room with no air. You smile, you engage, you ask the right questions. But beneath it all, there's a quiet voice asking, when can I leave? This is the first sign, the awareness that while others are being filled, you are being emptied. At first, you might think it's just this particular event. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're not in the mood. Maybe you just don't like these people. But then it happens again and again. Different people, different settings, same result. The exhaustion is consistent. The need to retreat is undeniable. And slowly you begin to understand, it's not the people, it's not the place, it's the act itself. The act of being in social spaces drains something essential from you, and this is where the confusion begins. Because society tells you that connection is supposed to energize, that people are supposed to lift you up, that if you're feeling drained by social interaction, something must be wrong with you. But here's what they don't tell you. Energy is not a universal currency. What fills one person can empty another. What feels nourishing to an extrovert can feel depleting to someone wired differently. And for those who are deeply internal, who process the world through reflection rather than reaction, social gatherings aren't just tiring, they're existentially exhausting. Why? Because every interaction requires something from you, not just words, not just presence, but a kind of energetic output that isn't always visible. You're reading faces, interpreting tones, navigating unspoken social codes, managing your own responses, while simultaneously absorbing the emotional frequencies of everyone around you. And if you're someone who feels deeply, who notices subtleties others miss, who picks up on the undercurrents beneath polite conversation, you're doing all of this at a level most people never experience. It's like being asked to run a marathon while everyone else is taking a casual walk. They don't understand why you're exhausted. And you can't quite explain it without sounding like you're complaining. Thomas Merton wrote extensively about the noise of the world, not just literal noise, but the constant demand for attention, performance, and presence. He believed that modern life had become an assault on the soul, a relentless pulling outward when what many people truly needed was to turn inward. He saw solitude not as isolation, but as a return to the self, a way of protecting the inner life from the chaos of external demands. For those who are drained by social gatherings, this idea resonates deeply, because the exhaustion isn't just physical, it's spiritual. It's the feeling that in trying to be present for everyone else, you've lost connection with yourself. That in the effort to meet social expectations, you've abandoned the quiet voice inside that needs space to exist. And this is where the real danger begins. Because when you're constantly drained by the very thing society tells you should energize you, you start to doubt yourself. You start to think maybe there is something wrong. Maybe you're antisocial. Maybe you're broken. Maybe you just need to try harder. So you push. You force yourself to attend more gatherings. You overcompensate with enthusiasm you don't feel. You stay longer than you want to. You say yes when every part of you wants to say no. And all the while, you're slowly disappearing. Not from the world, but from yourself. I once knew someone who described social gatherings as wearing a mask, not in the sense of being fake, but in the sense of having to assemble a version of themselves that could function in that space. They had to monitor their energy, calibrate their responses, be just present enough without being too much or too little, and by the end of the night, they weren't sure who they were anymore. The mask had done its job. But the person underneath was exhausted, confused, and desperately in need of silence. This is what people don't understand. For some, socializing isn't just tiring, it's a kind of identity fragmentation. In trying to be what the situation requires, you lose touch with what you actually are. And the more you do this, the more disconnected you become. Not from others, but from the truest version of yourself. And here's the tragedy. While others leave gatherings feeling connected, recharged and fulfilled, you leave feeling more alone than before. Because even though you were surrounded by people, you weren't really there. You were performing, managing, surviving, and true connection, the kind that actually nourishes, requires presence. Not the presence of your body, but the presence of your authentic self. And that's the one thing you couldn't afford to bring. So the gatherings that are supposed to bring people together end up isolating you further. The very spaces designed for connection become places where you feel most disconnected. And the exhaustion isn't just about tired muscles or a busy schedule. It's about the deep, aching loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling utterly unseen. Merton understood this loneliness. He wrote about the peculiar isolation of being in the world, but not of it. Of feeling like a stranger even among familiar faces. He believed that this wasn't a flaw but a calling, a sign that your soul was oriented toward something different, something deeper, something that couldn't be found in the noise. But the world doesn't honor this. Instead, it pathologizes it. It labels introversion as something to be fixed. It treats the need for solitude as a problem. It pushes people toward extroversion as if it were the only healthy way to exist. And those who are naturally inclined toward inner reflection, toward quiet processing, toward solitary rejuvenation, they're made to feel as though they're failing at being human. This pressure creates a painful paradox. You're exhausted by social gatherings, but you're also ashamed of being exhausted. You want to leave, but you feel guilty for wanting to leave. You need solitude, but you've been taught to see solitude as loneliness. So you stay. You push. You override your own needs in service of social expectations, and in doing so, you slowly erode the very foundation of your well-being. Because here's what no one tells you. Your need for solitude isn't selfishness. Your exhaustion in crowds isn't weakness. Your preference for deep one-on-one conversations over large gatherings isn't anti-social. It's simply the way your energy works. And denying that is like asking a tree to grow without sunlight. You might survive for a while, but you'll never thrive. The truth is, people have different energetic architectures. Some are solar-powered. They need the external world to recharge. Others are lunar. They need the quiet, the darkness, the inward turn. Neither is better. Neither is healthier. They're just different. But we live in a solar-dominant culture, one that celebrates the outward, the loud, the socially adept. And those who are lunar are left feeling like there's something fundamentally wrong with them. Merton chose the monastery precisely because he understood this about himself. He knew that his soul required silence, that his capacity for depth was directly tied to his capacity for solitude, that in the absence of noise he could hear something essential, not just God, not just truth, but himself, the authentic, unperformed, unfiltered version of who he was beneath all social conditioning. And this is where the shift happens. The moment you realize that your exhaustion isn't a problem, it's information. It's your soul telling you something important. It's your inner world asking for what it needs, and what it needs isn't to be fixed, it's to be honored. You don't need to become more extroverted, you don't need to force yourself into social situations that deplete you. You don't need to apologize for needing time alone. What you need is to understand that your wiring is valid, that your energy is precious, that protecting your inner life isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation. This doesn't mean you should avoid all social interaction. It doesn't mean you should become a hermit. But it does mean you get to choose. You get to decide which gatherings are worth your energy and which ones aren't. You get to set boundaries. You get to leave early. You get to say no. And you get to do all of this without guilt, without explanation, without feeling like you owe anyone a justification for your needs, because the people who truly matter will understand. They'll see that your need for solitude isn't rejection. They'll recognize that your limited social energy doesn't mean you don't care. They'll honor your boundaries because they understand that real connection happens when people show up authentically, not when they force themselves into situations that drain them. And for those who don't understand, they're not your people. Not because they're bad, but because they're operating from a different energetic blueprint. They experience the world in a way that's fundamentally different from yours, and that's okay. But it also means you don't need to contort yourself to fit their expectations. Merton wrote that solitude is not the absence of love, but its deepest expression. That in choosing to honor your need for quiet, you're not abandoning the world, you're preparing yourself to meet it more fully. Because when you're energetically depleted, when you've given everything to social performance, you have nothing left to offer. Not to others, not to your work, not to yourself. But when you honor your need for solitude, when you give yourself the space to recharge in the way that actually works for you, something shifts. You become more present, more grounded, more capable of genuine connection, not because you've forced yourself to be more social, but because you've learned to protect the energy that allows you to show up authentically when it matters. This is the paradox that society misses. The people who need solitude aren't avoiding connection. They're preparing for it. They're ensuring that when they do engage, they can do so from a place of fullness rather than depletion. They understand that real connection isn't about quantity. It's about quality. And quality requires energy, presence, and authenticity, all of which are impossible when you're running on empty. So what happens when you stop fighting your nature? When you stop trying to be energized by things that drain you, when you start honoring your need for solitude instead of apologizing for it. You find your rhythm. You discover that you can attend the gatherings that matter without destroying yourself in the process. You learn to show up fully for the people who see you, rather than partially for everyone. You create space in your life for the quiet that your soul requires. And in that quiet, you find something extraordinary. Not loneliness, not isolation, but peace, clarity, connection to something deeper than small talk and surface-level interaction. You begin to understand that the exhaustion you felt wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of misalignment. You were trying to live according to someone else's blueprint. And now, finally, you're living according to your own. This doesn't mean the world will suddenly understand. You'll still be invited to gatherings that drain you. People will still ask why you're so quiet, why you left early, why you don't come out more. And you'll still feel the pressure, the subtle judgment, the implication that there's something wrong with your preferences. But here's the difference. You'll know better. You'll understand that their confusion isn't your responsibility, that their expectations aren't your obligation, that you get to define what connection means for you, and that your definition is just as valid as theirs. Merton spent years defending his choice of solitude. People questioned it. They worried about him. They wondered if he was lonely, if he was hiding, if he was wasting his gifts by withdrawing from the world, but he knew something they didn't. That in his solitude he was more connected than he'd ever been in the crowd. That in the silence he could hear what the noise drowned out. That in withdrawing from constant social performance he could finally be authentic. And this is the gift that awaits those who honor their need for solitude. Not isolation, not loneliness, but authenticity. The rare and precious experience of being truly yourself. Not the version you perform at gatherings, not the mask you wear to fit in, but the unfiltered, unperformed, essential you. This is what the world loses when it pushes everyone toward the same energetic model. It loses the depth that can only come from silence, the wisdom that emerges from reflection, the insight that requires space to develop. It loses the gifts of those who see differently, feel differently, process differently. And it loses them not because these people don't want to contribute, but because they're too exhausted from pretending to be something they're not. So here's what I want you to understand. If social gatherings drain you while they energize others, you're not broken. You're not antisocial. You're not failing at being human. You're simply wired for depth in a world obsessed with breadth. You're oriented toward the internal in a culture that celebrates the external. You're lunar in a solar-dominant society, and that's not a flaw, it's a feature. Your exhaustion is information, listen to it. Your need for solitude is wisdom, honor it. Your preference for quiet isn't weakness, it's strength. Because it takes courage to live authentically in a world that's constantly asking you to be someone else. Merton found God in the silence. Not because God wasn't in the crowd, but because in the silence he could finally hear. You might not be looking for God. You might be looking for yourself, for clarity, for peace, for the energy to show up fully in the moments that truly matter. But the principle is the same. The quiet holds something that the noise cannot provide. And when you finally give yourself permission to seek that quiet without guilt, without apology, without the constant justification, something extraordinary happens. You stop feeling drained by the gatherings you attend because you're no longer attending all of them. You stop feeling guilty for leaving early because you know that protecting your energy is an act of self-respect. You stop feeling broken for being different because you finally understood that different doesn't mean defective. You become someone who knows their limits, who honors their needs, who shows up authentically when they show up at all. And in a world full of people forcing themselves into spaces that drain them, performing energy they don't feel, and wondering why they're always exhausted, you become something rare. You become someone who's genuinely present, not because you're at every gathering, but because when you are present, you're actually there. This is the quiet revolution. Not of rejecting the world, but of engaging with it on your own terms. Not of avoiding connection, but of seeking the kind of connection that actually nourishes. Not of isolating yourself, but of creating space for the authenticity that makes real relationship possible. And in the end, this is what matters. Not how many gatherings you attend. Not how energized you seem to others. Not how well you perform the social expectations, but whether you're living in alignment with your truest nature, whether you're honoring the energy that makes you who you are, whether you're brave enough to be lunar in a solar world. Because the world needs both. It needs the people who light up rooms and the people who illuminate depths. It needs the energy of extroversion and the wisdom of introversion. It needs those who find connection in crowds and those who find it in quiet conversation. It needs the solar and the lunar. But it can only receive what each has to offer when both are allowed to exist authentically. When the lunar aren't pressured to be solar. When the introverted aren't shamed for their need for solitude. When exhaustion in social spaces is understood not as a problem, but as a truth. So if you've been fighting your nature, trying to be energized by things that drain you, forcing yourself into gatherings that leave you empty, this is your permission to stop. To honor what you know about yourself. To protect the energy that makes your authentic presence possible, to choose solitude without guilt and connection without performance. You are not broken. You are not antisocial. You are not failing. You are simply living according to a different blueprint. One that requires silence to flourish, one that needs space to breathe, one that finds depth not in the many but in the few, in the quiet, in the authentic. And that blueprint is just as valid, just as beautiful, just as necessary as any other. Merton knew this, he lived it, and in doing so he gave permission to everyone who ever felt drained by the very things that were supposed to energize them. He showed that solitude isn't loneliness, that quiet isn't emptiness, that withdrawing from the noise isn't rejection, it's reclamation. So reclaim yourself, reclaim your energy, reclaim your right to exist according to your own nature, and watch what happens when you stop apologizing for needing what you've always needed. You might lose some invitations, you might be misunderstood, you might be seen as the one who always leaves early, who doesn't come out much, who prefers to be alone. And that's okay, because what you'll gain is infinitely more valuable. You'll gain yourself, your energy, your authenticity, your peace, and in a world that's constantly pulling you outward, asking you to be more, do more, show up more, the quiet courage to turn inward and protect what's essential is perhaps the most radical act of all. So be lunar, be quiet, be still, be authentically, unapologetically yourself, and know that in honoring your need for solitude, you're not rejecting the world, you're preparing to meet it as you truly are, rested, present, whole. And that version of you, the one who no longer forces, performs, or depletes themselves for social approval, is the one the world has been waiting for all along. But let's go deeper, because there's another layer to this that needs to be explored. A layer that most people never reach because they're too busy trying to fix what they think is broken. The exhaustion you feel in social gatherings isn't just about energy expenditure. It's about existential displacement. It's about the feeling that in order to exist in social spaces, you have to temporarily vacate yourself. You have to set aside your inner world, your thoughts, your observations, your depth, and occupy a different mode of being, one that's lighter, quicker, more superficial. Not because you want to be superficial, but because depth doesn't translate well in crowds. Think about it. In a room full of people, conversation moves fast. Topics shift rapidly. There's no time for the kind of deep processing that comes naturally to you. No space for the contemplation that makes your thoughts meaningful. You can't pause to really consider what someone said. You can't sit with an idea and let it unfold. You have to respond quickly, keep up, stay engaged. And for someone whose mind works slowly, deliberately, deeply, this is exhausting. It's like being asked to sprint when your natural pace is a walk. Not because you can't sprint, but because sprinting prevents you from seeing what you're designed to see. The details, the nuances, the subtle shifts in meaning that only reveal themselves when you slow down. And here's what makes this particularly painful. Society interprets your slowness as inadequacy, your need to process as hesitation, your depth as overthinking. So not only are you exhausting yourself trying to keep up, you're also internalizing the message that your natural pace is wrong, that the way you think is a problem, that you need to be faster, lighter, more immediate. But speed and depth are inversely related. The faster you go, the less you see. The more you skim the surface, the less you understand what lies beneath. And for those who are built for depth, who need time to process, who understand that real insight requires contemplation, the demand for social speed is a violence against their nature. Merton wrote about this too, about the tyranny of constant activity, about how the modern world had become addicted to doing, achieving, performing at the expense of being. He saw that in the rush to be productive, efficient, socially engaged, people had lost touch with the contemplative dimension of existence, the part that requires stillness, that emerges only in silence, that cannot be rushed or forced or performed. And this is why social gatherings can feel so alienating, because they exist almost entirely in the realm of doing, of performing. Of constant action and reaction, there's no space for being, for simply existing without agenda, for letting your presence speak rather than your words, for allowing silence to be enough. I remember someone telling me about a party where they spent 2 hours without saying much. They listened, they observed, they were present in their own quiet way, and at the end of the night, someone asked them if they were okay, as if their silence was a sign of distress, as if the only valid way to exist in social space was to be actively, visibly engaged. This is the assumption that silence equals absence, that if you're not talking, you're not participating, that presence requires performance. But for those who live deeply, silence isn't absence. It's the fullest form of presence. It's the state in which they're most themselves, most aware, most connected, not to the noise, but to something underneath it. And when you're forced to abandon that silence, to fill it with words you don't really mean, with laughter that doesn't really come from you, with engagement that's more about meeting expectations than authentic expression, you lose yourself, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that leaves you feeling hollow by the end of the night. This is the real exhaustion, not physical tiredness, but spiritual depletion. The feeling that in trying to be present for everyone else, you've become absent to yourself, that you've spent hours being someone you're not, and now you need to find your way back to who you are. And the recovery from this isn't quick. It's not like you can just go home and immediately feel like yourself again. It takes time, sometimes hours, sometimes days. You need silence, space, solitude. Not because you're avoiding the world, but because you're recovering from the cost of being in it in a way that violated your nature. This is what people don't understand when they say just push through it, or it gets easier with practice. They're assuming that your exhaustion is about social anxiety or lack of skill. But it's not. It's about fundamental incompatibility. You're being asked to operate in a mode that goes against your deepest wiring. And no amount of practice will make that not exhausting. What does help is acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of resignation, but acceptance in the sense of understanding. When you finally accept that your energy works differently, that you're not meant to be energized by the same things that energize others, that your need for solitude is as valid as anyone's need for socializing, something shifts. You stop trying to fix yourself. You stop measuring your social capacity against an external standard. You stop feeling guilty for needing what you need. And in that acceptance, you find a kind of freedom that you've never had before. You become someone who knows their limits without shame, who honors their needs without apology, who understands that protecting their energy isn't selfishness, it's the foundation of authentic living. Because when you're not constantly depleting yourself in social situations, when you're giving yourself the solitude you need to recharge, you actually have more to offer. Not to everyone, not all the time, but to the people and moments that truly matter. This is the difference between forcing yourself to be at every gathering and choosing the ones that align with your values. Between staying until the end because you're afraid of judgment and leaving when your energy tells you it's time. Between performing connection and experiencing it authentically. And here's what's beautiful about this shift. When you stop trying to be someone you're not, the right people start to find you, the ones who appreciate your depth, who value your thoughtful presence over constant chatter, who understand that your silence isn't disengagement, but a different form of engagement, who recognize that you offer something the world desperately needs, perspective, insight, authenticity born from inner reflection. These are the people worth your energy, the ones who don't drain you because they don't require you to perform. They accept your natural rhythm. They honor your need for space. They understand that your limited social capacity doesn't mean you care less. It means you care differently. More deeply, more selectively. Merton found community even in his solitude. Not the broad, shallow community of constant social interaction, but the deep, meaningful community of shared understanding. He engaged with ideas that mattered. He connected authentically with those who saw him. And he did all of this while maintaining the solitude that made such authentic connection possible. This is the model. Not isolation, but intentional engagement. Not rejecting all social interaction, but being deliberate about which ones serve your growth and which ones simply deplete you. Not avoiding people, but creating space for the right people, including yourself. Because at the end of the day, the most important relationship you have is the one with yourself. And if you're constantly abandoning yourself in service of social expectations, if you're always performing rather than being, if you're choosing external approval over internal peace, that relationship suffers. You become a stranger to yourself. You lose touch with the quiet wisdom that emerges only in solitude, and the cost of that is higher than most people realize. Because when you lose yourself in the noise, when you spend all your energy managing social performance, you lose access to the very thing that makes you valuable: your depth, your insight, your capacity to see what others miss, because you take the time to look closely. So here's the invitation. Stop pretending, stop forcing, stop apologizing for needing what you've always needed, and start honoring the truth of your nature. You're someone who needs solitude to thrive, who processes deeply rather than quickly, who finds connection in depth rather than breadth, who gains energy from silence and loses it in crowds. That's not a flaw. That's your design. And when you finally stop fighting it and start living according to it, everything changes. Not because the world suddenly understands, but because you do. And that understanding gives you permission to create a life that actually works for you, rather than one that simply meets external expectations. In the end, living authentically isn't about being understood by everyone. It's about understanding yourself so deeply that others' misunderstanding can't shake you. It's about knowing your truth so fully that you don't need external validation to live it. It's about being so grounded in your own nature that the pressure to be different loses its power. This is the gift of solitude. This is the wisdom of the contemplative path. This is what Merton knew and what you're learning. That in a world obsessed with noise, your silence is sacred. That in a culture addicted to doing, your being is revolutionary. That in an age that measures worth by social energy, your depth is priceless. So be drained by social gatherings if that's your truth. Leave early without guilt. Choose solitude without shame. Honor your need for quiet without apology. And know that in doing so, you're not rejecting the world. You're claiming your place in it, on your own terms, in your own rhythm, according to your own design. And that authentic presence, however quiet, however selective, however different from the norm, is the truest gift you have to offer.